So here at South Slough Reserve, there hasn't been a lot of fire management since 1974 when the reserve first came into being and started managing these lands. And it's something that we've been talking about a lot at the moment. We started working on a fire management plan that's under revision at the moment, and that kind of includes all things fire related, really, and the pros and the cons, the good things and the dangerous things. We like to think of it really holistically. So this particular program, the vision of it is to really bring a diverse group of voices and expertise to the table to help communicate about fire in our local area, provide trainings through the South Slough Reserve Coastal Training Program, and really delve into a lot of different aspects. So we started doing some defensible space work around the visitors centre, where we were managing some of the fuel loads in that area. And I'm hoping many of you can come to the in-person training opportunity, which will be later in the fall. I'm not sure if we've got a date on that yet, but hopefully soon we'll be able to announce that. We're going to have a lot more themes talked about at that training that will expand on what we hear today, but then also some new areas that we'll be exploring. So with that, I guess Sabra can introduce the speakers for today and talk a little bit more about, you know, the program that we're going to appreciate over the next few minutes or however long it takes.
Thank you very much for that, Alice. Just one other plug for my program. So the Coastal Training Program is meant to connect decision makers with technical and scientific information. So all of you present here count as decision makers in one capacity or another. One of the main ways that we fulfill our reporting requirements from NOAA and therefore continue to get funding is via short evaluations after workshops or trainings. So you'll be seeing a link to that both at the end of this program as well as sent to you via email later. It takes less than 10 minutes to complete, and again, it's very important and central to us continuing to be able to offer these at affordable rates or free. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speakers today. So we have Brenda Bologna, who's going to be up first, and she's going to be talking about fire weather. And then we're going to be jumping over to Norma Klein, who's going to be going through defensible space as well as more broadly fire management techniques. And then we're going to be finishing up with Kelpie Wilson talking about biochar in a lot of aspects. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Brenda.
Okay, and it's actually Bologna, but a lot of people don't pronounce it right. So my husband proposed to me by asking me if I could spend the rest of my life with a name nobody can say when they see it or spell when they hear it. So, you know, here we go. All right. I'm going to share my screen here. And you should be able to see that. Does it?
It looks good.
Okay, very good. A little bit about my background. I am a retired professional meteorologist, an operational meteorologist specifically, and most people would recognize that as being a weather forecaster. And I spent 34 of my 36 years in the industry associated with wildland fire. Ended up being my specialty. I love it, and so on and so forth. So I live in Coos Bay, Oregon. By choice, I love the climate here. I'm not much of a lizard, I'm a penguin, so I like the cool coastal climate. What I'm going to do today is talk about the fire weather and fire behavior in a nutshell. We only have about 30 minutes to do this, so here we go. Let me get to the right place here. There we go. Get my controls going. In the wildland fire world, there's a trifecta of triangles that we refer to. And You know, if you know all of this stuff, that's great. If not, hopefully it's new for some folks. The first is the fire triangle. And it doesn't matter whether we're talking about structures or we're talking about the wildland environment, the idea is the same. And that is by removing one leg of the triangle, it makes fire unsustainable. So you remove fuel, you cool it off, or you take the oxygen away. These three elements will support the fire. And if you starve it of one, it usually will either knock down the fire or get rid of it completely. The second triangle is referred to as the fire environment triangle, and that has three parts to it. One is fuels, and the fuels themselves are really important as to how a fire is going to spread, behave, what you get. So what type of fuel is out there? Is it primarily timber, grass, brush? It's often a combination of those, but that in itself is important. The moisture content of the fuel is very important. That's affected by weather and the vegetation annual growth cycle. Very typical. Most people know that annual grasses, you know, they're very green and lush in the spring, and then they, as we get further towards summer and well into summer, then they will actually dry out. A lot of times they turn brown. So that's what I mean by annual growth cycles. But even perennials have their own growth cycles and moisture content cycles as well. And then there's the spatial arrangement of the fuels themselves. Are things compact, like a bale of hay, for instance, is a good example, or are they loosely piled? If you were to take a bale of straw, for instance, and then you open it up and spread it around, if you have, you know, horses, for instance, and you're putting fresh straw in their stall, then you break that straw bale up and fluff up the straw. And in this case, oxygen availability rules in this case, where the more surface area that fuel you have exposed to air, the more readily it can burn. A compact, dense spatial arrangement doesn't have as much oxygen available to the fuels. It tends to burn a little more slowly. Witness the fact, if you've ever seen a hay bale fire, it tends to smolder a lot, whereas things that are loosely piled can burn very readily. So that's a fire behavior thing. Next in the fire environment triangle is topography. What aspect is it facing? Is it facing northeast, south, or west? And if you have any questions about how to figure that out, if you were to lay down on a slope with your feet downhill and look straight out, then what direction would you be facing? That's sometimes how it's described to figure that out. This contributes to fuel type and the condition. South aspects tend to be a lot drier and warmer. North aspects, the total opposite of the south, tend to be more moist and cooler in our part of the world. If you go to Hawaii, it's different. Go to Australia, it's different, of course. But here, north and south are the diametric opposites. East slopes get sun early in the day, west slopes get it late in the day. So the sun rules when it comes to aspect. Slope steepness is also a factor. The steeper slope, the faster a fire will spread on it. A fire loves to run uphill, and it has a difficult time backing down a hill. And again, there's more to it than that, but that's it in a nutshell. And topography affects weather and climate. A really good example of that here in Oregon is west versus east side of the Cascades, where it tends to be wetter and more lush on the west side, drier on the east side. And then add the coast into that, and even west of the Cascades, coast versus the rest of the west of the Cascades. So the topography does make a big difference about weather and climate. Then the final leg of the fire environment triangle is weather, and it directly affects fuels, mainly seasonal conditioning and as well as actual daily conditions. I tell people that in this fire environment triangle, weather is the 2-year-old of the group. And if you've ever had a 2-year-old in the house, you know you have to keep an eye on it because you know very changeable, somewhat unpredictable. Fuels tend to, this isn't Treebeard's Forest where everybody gets up and walks around in the middle of the night. So once you know where the grass is and once you know where the trees are, then you've got that settled. Certainly fuels change over, fuel conditions change over time, and there's a spatial aspect to fuels as well. So they change over space and time, but they don't change rapidly. Weather, of course, can be different from literally moment to moment. Topography is another thing. Once you know what the topography is, it pretty much stays the same. If we have the big Cascadia quake, well, things could change in an instant, of course. But as far as topography goes, then we got bigger problems to worry about than fire maybe. So those are the three elements of the fire weather triangle, triangle number 2. The third triangle in the trifecta is the fire weather triangle. And that has elements, of course, temperature moisture relationships are one leg of it. And in, under that heading comes relative humidity. And relative humidity is relative to temperature. You change the temperature, you tend to change the relative humidity. Basically, low values of RH dry fuels. I'll talk about some specific thresholds for that shortly. And then precipitation is also a key element here. The duration and the amounts that we get are significant. Short duration is less effective at moistening fuels, believe it or not, than long duration. Also, I'm sure you've been in a thunderstorm where the heavens pour and you get a ton of rain in a very short period of time. So an inch in 20 minutes of precipitation in 20 minutes is far less moistening in the environment than that same inch of precipitation delivered over even 24 or 48 hours. Creates two radically different environmental changes. So precip duration and the amount you get is significant. Along the coast, if we get mist, you might not get a lot of duration, or might not get a lot of amounts wise, might not measure a lot, but sustained mist can really put a damper on fire danger. Another leg of the fire weather triangle is atmospheric stability. And atmospheric stability is a little tricky, but basically if you have an unstable atmosphere, you support the opportunity for thunderstorms to occur. Thunderstorms, ergo lightning, is that fostered today right near the coast. We don't see many summertime thunderstorms because the marine layer mitigates that, the opportunity for them to form. We actually tend to see more in the winter time than we do in the summer right along the coast, but you don't have to go very far inland to have thunderstorm conditions be fostered. And then the other aspect of atmospheric stability, whether we have the right ingredients for thunderstorms or not, is you can think of it as how well ventilated is the fire column. So if you think of a fire plume as being something like a chimney, how well ventilated is that chimney? And the more unstable the atmosphere is, the more fire growth is fostered. And finally, wind is a big deal also in the fire weather triangle. It is largely responsible for where and how fast a fire spreads. And slope and wind work together, but I have seen strong enough winds override the effects of slope. So if we have to pick a 2-year-old of the fire weather triangle, wind is it. It is, of course, very variable across the landscape. And with time, there are daily cycles to it that are very common, but it's also the most difficult fire weather element to forecast accurately. Very tough and convoluted terrain or complex terrain. But believe it or not, everybody thinks it's so mysterious how to forecast weather. There are rules. There is science behind it. And we do know that there are some typical things that wind will do in certain environments, and the other clue to that is what are the mechanisms locally that drive these winds. And once we understand that, then we have a good chance of forecasting them reasonably well. Let's talk about a couple of specific things related to fire weather, and this is a typical daily or diurnal temperature relative humidity pattern trace. Normally what we see overnight, of course, is our lowest temperatures, which is the top half of the chart, looking at temperatures throughout a 24-hour cycle. And relative humidity is inversely proportional typically. We see our highest relative humidities and our highest fuel moistures overnight with our lowest temperatures. And then in the afternoon, when things dry out, somewhere in the vicinity of the maximum temperature, we'll find our minimum relative humidity and our driest fuels. If you've been around wildland fire at all, you might notice that it tends to have a diurnal cycle where it will calm down at night. The fire will do what we call lay down. And then in the afternoon, we get into the normal daily burning period cycle where the fire tends to kick up in the afternoon into the early evening hours. This pattern is very common, but as in many things with weather, there's almost always exceptions to most things in weather. So while this is typical and a very good planning tool, it is not an absolute. There are exceptions to this when you can see warmer temperatures and lower humidity overnight develop in certain weather patterns in different areas of the country and even here along our own Oregon coast. So another question for folks is what fuels typically carry fire through the landscape? I think most of us are used to seeing images on the news of these major conflagrations where the whole forest is involved. And certainly there are times where that's key, but a lot of folks don't realize that it's the little stuff in the landscape that matters the most. And that isn't to say that you can't get an entire tree canopy involved or a large brush field or what we would call heavy fuel loading, a lot of dead and down things. Think about the slash piles that get left behind in a logging operation. If they haven't piled them up, actually, if the slash is just laying on the ground, that can create a certain environment as well. But more typically, it's the small stuff that's 1/4 of an inch in diameter or less that will carry the fuel through the landscape. So when the conversation comes up very soon here about defensible space around structures, what we try to do is minimize those small fuel conditions near the structure or minimize the likelihood of them being a part of the game, while also taking care of the larger fuels that are nearby so that they don't present ladders of fuel, a ladder for fuel to climb into the canopy and that sort of thing. So that's coming up. But in normal conditions, it's the stuff on the ground and the little stuff that'll sustain a fire. So think about this as being like kindling in a fire as opposed to big logs. And if you've ever started a campfire, you know you can't just torch off larger fuels in your campfire. You got to have some little stuff to get things going. So connecting weather, fuel moisture, and fire activity is pretty simple. If the relative humidity goes up, fuel moistures will go up. And we're talking about fine fuel moistures, meaning the little stuff, 1/4 inch and less. But it'll also affect the larger fuels, particularly in certain fuels bigger than 1/4 of an inch in certain times of the growth cycle and that sort of thing. But this is a general rule that applies. RH goes down, the fuel moisture is going to go down as well. And so fire doesn't care really what time of day it is. It just knows whether it's got good food or not. So in other words, fuel's dry enough to burn. When fuel moisture lowers, then fire activity is going to increase. And again, these are general fire behavior rules. Fuel moisture increases, then fire activity tends to decrease. And this is why we see that relationship on a diurnal cycle. Overnight relative humidity rises, increase that fuel moisture, and decrease the fire activity. And in the afternoons, when the relative humidity drops, the fuel moisture drops, it becomes more available for the fire to be sustained across the landscape, and fire activity increases. So again, relative humidity is typically lower in the afternoons and higher overnight, but as I mentioned before, that's not always true. And we have several RH thresholds of interest. Around 20% or less encourages a fire spread. Again, keeping in mind that we're talking about those little tiny fuels, 1/4 inch and less, that are affected by that relative humidity. And an exception to this would be if you have really green grass and the RH is down around 20 or less, well, then green grass doesn't burn so well. But we're assuming that, you know, this is associated with dried or cured fuels. And then around 35% or more tends to limit fire spread when we get into that environment. So in our diurnal cycle, when we monitor fire weather, we're looking for these thresholds to see our changes in fire activity. A few more specifics about atmospheric stability. And atmospheric stability refers to the vertical motion of air. And the more vertical motion, the more likely air is to move vertically in the atmosphere, then the better ventilated things can be. Unstable air tends to move vertically and stable air does not. If we have unstable conditions, that supports active fire. If we have relatively stable conditions, you don't see a lot of smoke rise or vertical development in clouds, then the fire tends to be less active. And then we can also have a mixture. The atmosphere is sort of like a layered cake. Sometimes you have unstable layers with stable layers. And in this last right-hand image, there's both unstable and stable layers. And this particular fire is supported by an unstable layer closer to the ground, but it will be limited by the stable layer aloft. So we spend a lot of time as fire weather meteorologists trying to figure all this stuff out ahead of time. That's the trick. To address conditions specifically along our Southwest Oregon coast area, and this really applies all up and down the coast, because I noticed we have people from further north than the Coos Bay area or the Southwest coast area. The marine layer is everything right near the coast. So it governs much of what happens near the coast. And what do I mean by near the coast? Probably within 3 or 4 miles at the most, a lot of times inland. So for instance, if you're familiar with the Coos Bay area, Coos Bay, Saturday was a great example. Coos Bay was officially 80 degrees at the North Bend Airport, which sits right on the bay. But just inland in Coquille, it was 90 for a high temperature. So you don't have to go very far inland or above. If you get above the marine layer, then things will be quite noticeably warmer and drier. So that's, you can grow corn in Coquille, but don't try that in Coos Bay type of thing. And this is a feature all up and down the Oregon coast, and the West Coast, period. So summers tend to be rather windy from the north. There is semi-permanent weather patterns that set this up. And also when our interior locations, inland locations warm up, that helps draw the marine air in from off the ocean as well. And depending on that temperature differential, since wind is driven by temperature differentials, the warmer it is inland, then the stronger our winds can be along the coast. So there are seasonal patterns to our wind regimes, and occasionally we get winds from the east or southeast, and those can spell trouble for us. It tends to minimize the marine layer effects. Southeast flow can bring thunderstorms into the region, even to the coast. And east winds are very similar. They're very dry. And southeast winds can occur during the summer without too much trouble. Typically, we're going to see easterly winds in the fall, the strongest easterly winds in the fall. And this is particularly noticeable along the west slopes of the Cascades. They can occur a couple times in the year, but the fall is the most active one, if we get them. I haven't had them for a few years. And as mentioned earlier, our late summer and fall times here tend to have the highest fire danger, even right at the coast. A couple factors can contribute to that. And that is because the fuels are now at the end of their growth cycle. They're at their driest. Also in the fall, we tend to see our northerly winds decrease appreciably, and that die off of those northerly winds allows other wind directions to come in, including those easterly winds. And we get easterly winds. It's a very dry wind for us, so that can be a decided fire danger higher fire danger situation. And it's interesting to note that there have been cases where prescribed burns that have been done earlier in the year will come back to life in the fall easterly winds. That's happened a number of times. I'm going to talk a little bit about severe weather, severe fire weather as well. Severe weather in general, most people think of tornadoes and hurricanes and things like that, but in fire weather we have our own considerations for severe fire weather conditions, and a short definition of that is that it's a particular combination of certain weather events along with dry fuels that can contribute to intense fire and rapid fire spread. And these all create control problems. They create safety problems for the public as well as firefighters. So we look at these, and it's pretty easy to see them coming, believe it or not. These are generally well-known weather patterns that cause such situations, so we can see them coming, and they're not terribly difficult to forecast, believe it or not, with a little bit of experience. So this is something that fire weather forecasters are always watching for, always nervous about, is when do we get these patterns to develop. So when it comes to severe fire weather, how do we find out what that is? First of all, these conditions are indicated to the public via the media, but the National Weather Service is the entity that creates what are called red flag events. And then there is a land management agency, and by land management agency I mean BLM or Forest Service, U.S. Forest Service, even the state supports it, ODFW, but not ODFW, the ODF. I got the W. They don't have the W in there. The fire people. Anyway, predictive services associated with the land management agencies will also have a little different focus in their point of view, but they issue some indication of what the risk of significant fire potential is. So these are things we can find online. I'll point that out here in just a second. I also want to say that the National Weather Service has the sole legal authorization to designate red flag conditions. So this is the one we hear about the most. And so what does that mean? You'll hear two things. There's fire weather watches, and these are issued when there's some uncertainty that severe fire weather events are going to develop. And finally, when we get to a red flag warning itself, that's issued when those severe fire weather events are imminent or already happening. So there's a lot of other weather watches and weather warnings, but in fire weather, this is what you hear, and it's hard to keep a watch straight from a warning. Doesn't really matter which one it is. If you hear either, then be on the alert and seek more information. To find out more about fire weather forecasts, you can go to weather.gov, and an interactive map will come up. You can click on your county of interest or your general geographic area of interest, and it will take you to the nearest National Weather Service forecast office that is covering that area in along the Oregon coast. That's either going to be Portland or Medford. And this map may be of interest to you anyway, because weather.gov will take you to an all hazards map, and it shows a very colorful map of where things are. Usually you look for the hot pink for for significant fire weather stuff, the fire weather, the red flag warnings, excuse me, the red flag warnings there. And don't go to weather.com. That's the Weather Channel. That's not where you want to go for this stuff. They'll regurgitate the information, but they don't have the authority to issue it. And the second thing is predictive services. In this case, for the Pacific Northwest, they cover Washington and Oregon portion of the Pacific Northwest, is based in Portland. Okay, I think we have a couple minutes for a few questions, if there are any.
You can either raise your hand or put something into the chat. I'll call on you.
Either everybody hasn't had enough caffeine yet, or I did too good of a job. Either way, Sabra, I'll stop sharing my screen.
Right. All right, if we don't have any questions immediately, then sorry, we're going to have a longer Q&A session at the end. Oh, and we're getting some compliments in the chat. Very good job, Brenda, and digesting it all. So if anyone thinks of anything during one of the other presentations, we're going to have a all panelists Q&A session at the end. So with that,
I appreciate Tracy Olson's comment in there, and when I said fire was maybe not one of our biggest problems, I meant wildland fire. Absolutely, it's an issue, especially in the urban or developed areas. And we're going to be more concerned with our safety from that point of view. So I didn't mean to belittle the fact that there wouldn't be fire. It's just that from a forest fire point of view, it might not be our biggest concern. But that's great, well stated info in there that you put in the chat.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, with that, I'm going to go ahead and call on Norma.
Hello, I'm going to share my screen and see if I've done that correctly. Let's see. Okay, do you see my presentation slide?
Yep, looks good.
Excellent. And let me just move a few things around here. So great. So I'm Norma Klein. I'm the OSU Extension Forester for Coos and Curry counties. And I work primarily with small woodland owners, but pretty much I get involved with many things regarding forestry and natural resources and things that affect woodlands. So fire is definitely one of them. Forest health is another of my big, concerns that I work with. For example, sun oak death down in Curry County. So I have a cool thing. I get to work with lots of different kinds of regions in forestry, which pretty much means I'm a generalist. And so, and that's going to be, the scope of my presentation today. It's more general and practical things that you can think about and do. So I'm talking about defensible space and risk reduction and strategies to protect your home and property while appreciating the ecological role of wildfire as well. And so, Brenda did a great and excellent job with the fire weather background. And so that's really going to be helpful saying the background for this presentation. So yes, given the right weather conditions, of course, we can have fire in Western Oregon. And we think of Western Oregon as being a damp place, sometimes even as having asbestos forests. But fires, of course, do occur during our hot, dry summers. And trends throughout Oregon and the American West are for longer fire seasons, hotter summers, and drier fuels. And so we should expect, unfortunately, we should probably expect a lot more of this in the future. And so recent examples of big fires include the Checo Bar Fire in 2017 that was down in Curry County. And if you're here in 2021, you will remember the terrible air quality from the Labor Day fires. And this is actually a photo I just took from my house of, the days of weird, rosy colored air. And, the fires were all over the state, but we had some close by too. There was a fire in 42 South that was, getting some speed up. And we're very thankful that the fire protection folks were able to take that down. So historically, Western Oregon has experienced a number of very large forest fires. And these were generally associated with severe droughts, high temperatures, and east winds. And many of these tended to be stand replacement fires. So that means they burned at an intensity that killed most of the trees, leaving a sea of snags. However, there was also a long history of frequent burning of the prairies and oak woodlands in on the margins of the Willamette Valley by Native Americans. And so these fires tended to be of much lower intensity and maintain the prairie and woodland communities. And so you'll see on the screen just a listing of some of our larger fires. And most folks have heard of the 1936 Bandon fire, and burned the city of Bandon, I believe. And then another one that we hear a lot about is that 1868 Scottsburg fire. Now there's actually quite a bit of debate on some of the years, and there were some other fires in that period as well. But we think that the major one was in 1868, and it burned about 300,000 acres, and it burned most of the Elliott State Forest at that time. So although a variety of natural disturbances have shaped our forests over time, fire is the one with the most profound effect. So we know that historically, not all fires were the same, and some burned much hotter than others, and some forests burned more frequently, but the fires were less intense. And so forests that historically burned frequently but with low intensity included the Willamette Valley oak and the drier conifer forests like ponderosa pine. So high severity wildfires occurred in the state's wetter regions and higher elevations. And these fires were very intense, killing most of the trees. Historically, they occurred infrequently, only every 100 to 450 years, and often were very large. And so some forests actually had a history of both low and high severity fires. And these forests typically burned every 40 to 80 years. And sometimes the fires were confined to the surface, and other times they climbed into the crowns, killing all the trees. And so you can see here on the screen that, we're in this coastal forest area for the most part. And so our fire return interval historically has been much longer than some of these other regions. But the fire severity historically was severe. And so often an entire, large swaths of forest were burned. So we often think of fire in negative terms as something that destroys and damages, and indeed it can be. But it's important to recognize that wildfires have always occurred in our region, and wildfire can play a number of important ecological roles or functions. And for example, they consume fuels and reduce fuel loadings in the future, helping future fires, reduce future fire severity, that helps recycle nutrients and make them available for plant growth. It can reduce populations of insects and diseases that damage trees. And so on this photo on the screen, it shows an example of prescribed burning or AKA controlled burning, that's being used to restore native prairie habitats in the Willamette Valley. And similar projects are taking place in oak woodlands as well. So we can appreciate the important roles of wildfire, but we don't want our homes to burn and our properties to experience a high severity, intense wildfire. So let's talk about how to protect our homes in this wildland urban interface from fire. So this wildland urban interface, you'll often hear it called the WUI. So that's basically homes in the forest. So let's start by considering how homes are typically lost in wildfire. So a key finding of research in fire postmortems is that homes burn when ignited by embers or small spot fires, not from a giant wall of flames. So Jack Cohen, that's a quote he has on the screen here. Jack Cohen is a preeminent researcher on home loss and wildfire. And so a key implication of the research is that what the homeowner does on the home itself and the surrounding area out to 100 or so feet is the primary factor in determining the survivability of fire. And so proactive homeowners can do much to reduce their risk. So burning embers are like firebrands are like flaming snow. They accumulate on roofs and gutters at the base of the foundation. So there's this ember video, and we'll give you a link later on, and I highly recommend that folks see this video. It's very, very powerful. It's put out by the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. It shows that simple things like vent screening can make the difference between burning and not burning in an ember storm. So with ember storms in mind, we're going to discuss strategies for improving home survivability. And I'm going to start by talking about defensible space, things that we can do. So defensible space is the zone of reduced fuels around your home that will do essentially two main things. So the first thing is to reduce the spread and intensity of a fire as it approaches your home, or as a fire ignites on or near the home. And two, make it easier for firefighters to defend your home in a wildfire. And so generally the defensible space zone is 100 feet around your house, but it could be up to 200 feet or even more if your home is on a steep slope, or if you're surrounded by dense vegetation. And so the 30 feet closest to the home is absolutely the most critical to think about. And so the second zone is 30 to 100 feet. And then we have the 100 and 200 feet, and that's typically called the wildland fuel reduction zone. And so you're going to be doing things in these zones like pruning up lower tree limbs, creating spacing between trees and shrubs, cleaning up woody debris, and trimming back tree limbs that are touching or near the roof and siding of your home. You'll be maintaining fire breaks and through the use of turf, your lawns or hardscapes. So one way to think of these zones is that you're creating a discontinuity in fuels, both vertically and horizontally. And so, but it's important to know that it doesn't mean that you have to have a concrete pad or only lawn around your home, or that you need to cut down every tree in your zone. So the idea is to maintain a landscape that is lean. That means it's without dense contiguous vegetation, and it's clean with minimal dead vegetation, and it's green and irrigated if possible, and with fire-resistant plants. And we're going to talk through all this stuff quite a bit more. So first, let's talk about zone one. Zone one encircles the structure and all of its attachments. That includes wood decks, fences, and boardwalks. for at least 30 feet on all sides. And that's horizontal distance. So within the first 5 feet of zone 1, that's an area we call the fire-free zone. And it's really important to use non-flammable landscaping materials or high moisture content annuals and perennial plants. In the remainder of zone 1, plants should be carefully spaced and low growing, and they should be fire resistant. And so they should be free of resins and oils and waxes that can burn really easily. And so it's really important to space conifer trees in this zone, that they should be 30 feet between their crowns. And also, any trees that are near your house should be trimmed back. They should not be overhanging your home at all, or your chimney. And so your lawn should be mowed regularly, and your trees should be pruned up 6 to 10 feet from the ground. And it's a really great idea to keep this zone watered, irrigated. So water plants, trees, and mulch regularly. And removing dead vegetation from under your deck and within 10 feet of your house is also important, as well as any firewood stacks or propane tanks. That's not a good zone for those things to be in that first zone 1. So zone 2, that's as we're moving out from the house. Zone 2 is 30 to 100 feet from the home. And plants in this zone should be low growing, well irrigated, and less flammable. And so leave at least 30 feet between clusters, 2 to 3 trees, or 20 feet between individual trees, and encourage a mixture of deciduous and coniferous trees. And it's really important to avoid planting fire-prone trees like junipers, cedars, and cypresses, because they're extremely flammable, and you just don't want those trees near your house. So this is a great place to locate driveways, gravel walkways, and lawns, and these can all help create field breaks. Like a koi pond, that'd be a great thing as well. And so once again, you're going to want to prune trees up 10 feet from the ground. And so moving out further, zone 3 is 100 to 200 feet from the home, and this area should be thinned, and although less space between trees is required than in zone 2. So this is typically, you're going to think about this more as your native forest vegetation. So we're going to talk about specific strategies next. But before we get into the nitty-gritty of actually how to do all this stuff and apply it, any questions from what we've talked about to this point? And I can't see my chat, so if anyone's putting anything in the chat, Saber, you'll have to pop up.
Keeping an eye on it. And I don't see any raised hands. So actually, before we continue on, I'm going to go ahead and say let's take a quick bio break. So if you can all return by 10:26, if that gives people enough time to refill your coffee, stand up and stretch a little bit, what have you. So we'll go ahead and call this back in about 3 minutes. All right, Norma, you back?
I am.
All right, I hope everyone had a chance to stretch or get some more caffeine or whatever you needed to do. With that, we'll go ahead and resume.
Okay, great. So, let's see here. Okay, so, we talked, left you thinking about ember storms, as one of the most important factors. So when thinking about fire-resistant landscape around your home, it's really important to concentrate your efforts in zone 1, and that's the first 30 feet or so. And so, that's often is an irrigated zone, and that'd be a really good idea if it were. So this zone can provide significant protection to your home from wildfire if it's landscaped right. So let's see here. I'm sorry about that. So the goal of that zone is to literally starve an oncoming wildfire of fuel so that its intensity is diminished. And I know I have to click this to make it go. There it goes. And so you can see from this little video is that because you've reduced the fuels in the zones close to your house, the intensity of the fire is diminishing as it approaches your house. And that will hopefully reduce the fire danger to your home, to your direct home. So in that zone 1, consider transitioning your landscaping in that zone to fire-resistant plants. And so fire-resistant plants have foliage that's moist and supple and easily crushed. They're not aromatic. They don't tend to accumulate dead material. They're usually broadleaf or deciduous, but there's some evergreens out there too. And we have a little publication, PNW 590 on fire-resistant plants, and we'll give you a link for that later. And this is in contrast to highly flammable plants. And those are plants that contain fine or dry or dead material within the plant. They're typically aromatic and they have gummy sap. Their leaves, twigs, and stems may contain volatile waxes, terpenes, or oils, and they're often aromatic. And the sap is gummy, resinous, and has a strong odor. And so, I highly recommend for folks to, walk around your landscape and check out, what kinds of plants you have out there. And, it might be a good idea to do some culling or move things around. You can move some of these more flammable plants to further away from your home. But if your landscape is anything like mine, I have way too many plants. So culling out a few, that might not be a bad idea. And so this is this little depiction of a home that did not burn down, but it almost did. So the homeowners had done quite a bit of defensible space around their landscape. They'd done some thinning and reducing of fuels, but unfortunately they had left this hedge of ornamental juniper and right near their home. And so when a fire approached and threatened their home, an ember landed on this ornamental juniper and caught it on fire, and then caught the trees right near their home on fire. And luckily there was a fire crew nearby, and because so much of the rest of the landscape was defensible and there was a good access for the fire crew, they were able to put this out and save the home. So to find out more about fire-resistant plants, you can download this publication. And once again, we'll have that in a link later on. So hopefully I've convinced you that a well-maintained landscape with fire-resistant plants will be more fire-resistant. So let's move on from that zone 1 and move further away from your home in zones 2 and 3. So research in a variety of forest and woodland field types have revealed 4 basic principles for developing fire resistance. So the first is to reduce surface fuels. Those are the small sticks and other fine fuels on the ground surface. And then reduce ladder fuels so that the live crown or the branches of trees are elevated higher above the ground surface. And then to decrease crown density. And that's to space out the tree crown so fire has a harder time spreading between trees, and keeping the larger trees that are more likely to survive a fire. So in a nutshell, you are reducing both the amount and continuity of fuels. And here are some diagrams of that. So we're reducing the ladder fuels and decreasing the crown density in this zone, and keeping the larger trees as well. And so zone 2, once again, is 30 to 100 feet from the home. And so plants in this zone should be low growing and well irrigated and less flammable in this area. And so zone 3 is 100 to 200 feet from the home. And if you own property that goes out that far. And so this area should be thinned, although less space between trees is required than zone 2. And so a good practice in this zone is to thin the smaller and weaker trees, as well as the dead and dying trees, and to reduce the density of tall trees so that the canopies are not touching. And so this will leave plenty of room for canopy growth and improve general forest health in the future. But in the coastal area, I found that a lot of our vegetation, a lot of our trees grow very densely and tightly together. And so in this zone, you might have inherited a very dense thicket of trees. And it was probably a good idea to take this zone down carefully, bit by bit. Don't thin it out widely all at once, because we can have wind throw problems on the coast. And so when we go out to, when South SLU has their field trip, there'll be a good example of some of that. So once the area is thinned, remove ladder fuels. Begin by pruning the remaining trees to at least 10 feet off the ground. And this includes both live and dead limbs. And so if trees are less than 20 feet tall, only prune a third of the crown at a time. And once again, we're doing some of this work incrementally, not necessarily all at the same time. So make sure to reduce heavy accumulations of woody debris as well. And so this does not mean removing all organic matter. So you can maintain the duff layer, some medium to large logs, and moss. In addition, if the native shrub cover is extensive within the zone, you can create some distance between shrubs or leave them in a patchy fashion to reduce the continuity of fuel in the low-growing shrubs. And I recommend paying particular attention to removing any invasive species like Scotch broom and gorse. Excuse me. Also, if you chip the material, the chips should not be more than a couple inches deep on the soil. So if your property is anything like mine, which is just this typical coastal rural property, this is going to seem like a tremendous amount of work to create defensible space around your home. And so most of us are not going to be able to do everything at once. And I wouldn't expect you to be able to. So I recommend breaking your property up into sections and maintain that area near your house every year. So that's going to be your annual maintenance. And then cycle around the outer zone and completing a section a year. And so, for example, in annual tasks in zone 1, you'd start with a house and work your way outward. You keep decks and patios clear of debris, and particularly where the siding meets the deck. And you clean out any leaves, needles, or stored materials that could burn from under decks or porches. And during high fire danger, you'd remove any heat sources such as that firewood or spare building materials or old vehicles, anything that could catch embers or ignite by flames. Even the outside furniture on your deck is a good idea to put away. So the concept of this is to create a plan, break it down into pieces so it's not overwhelming and you're just doing a little bit every year. So it's really important to keep your gutters clear and to do this before wildfire season. So various types of gutter systems and screens have been developed to prevent debris from accumulating in gutters. And so you can think about this as just, if you have all these fine fuels in your gutters, it's like an ember, ember landing on that would just, it'd be like a little campfire. It's just an accident waiting to happen. Vents are another important issue. So vents are principal entry points for embers into a home. So typically vent screens have a 1/4 inch mesh, but they can still allow many embers to enter the home. And think about retrofitting your vents with 1/8 inch screens, or purchase vents that utilize baffles to prevent ember entry. So the vent cover on the right utilizes baffles. So if you have a deck, porch, overhang, or balcony, don't let combustible materials and debris accumulate under them, like the house on the left. So instead, it's a good idea to protect that area by screening with, with 8-inch wire mesh. And you can put that behind a decorative lattice. And so this will prevent embers from settling underneath your deck. And it's also best that an elevated wooden deck is not located at the top of a hill where it will be in direct line of fire moving up a slope. So now let's talk about how to help firefighters help you. So consider taking a few additional steps to aid firefighters in finding and protecting your property in an emergency. So it's a good idea to post a permanent non-combustible sign displaying your house number along the road, and that'll help firefighters find your home. And if you have a gate, it should be placed about 30 feet off the road and installed to open inward. And this way the truck can pull off the road to unlock the gate without having to reverse. And if possible, install a rapid entry system, which will allow the fire department access to padlocked and electric gates with a master key. And it's a good idea to contact your fire department to find out which brand they prefer to use, and if they have any other recommendations that will help them as well. And so make sure your driveway and other roads on your property are well maintained, and by trimming the vegetation on the edges and removing down logs. And so emergency vehicles need a clearance of 12 feet across the road and 15 feet high, as well as a turnaround with a radius of 45 feet. So firefighters are more effective with a good road system that reaches all of your property and has at least 2 exit routes. And so once again, it's a good idea to talk to your fire chief for help in creating an effective road system. And so let me see, how am I doing on time, Sabra?
You still got about another, I don't know, 8 minutes.
Oh, okay, okay. Thanks. Okay, so here's a good imagine. So when you're thinking about your driveway access, imagine you're a firefighter, and so would you drive up your driveway? So make sure it's clear of overhanging and encroaching vegetation. So something else that folks can consider is cisterns and ponds. They can be a ready source of water for firefighters in the event of a wildfire. And cisterns placed in a high location can allow for gravity to fill pumpers, or they can be buried beneath the ground. And others can be above ground and even filled by rainwater. Okay, so now we're going to go through some examples. And so how defensible? So basically it's the good, the bad, and the ugly. We see all sorts of interesting examples out there. So how defensible do you think this home is? So probably it's pretty obvious that there are needles collected on the roof, and the trees are going right up to the home. It looks like the roof is wooden and with vegetation. So this house is not very defensible. Let's see here, I've lost my mouse. Oh, here it is. So don't forget your outbuildings. If you have outbuildings far from your house, go out there and take a look and make sure they don't have overhanging limbs and debris. And this home is looking much better. So lots of good defensible space. It does have a deck that might not be screened. So that's something that this homeowner can think about. So fire agencies do not have the resources or manpower to defend every home during a wildfire. So it's important to take steps on your own to improve the survivability of people and homes. And so this FireWise Communities is a national interagency program that supports the effort to protect people and property from the risk of wildland fire. And I'll put a link to the FireWise in the end. So there's no way to make a home or community fireproof. And some fires just get too big and too hot. But if you take preventative actions and utilize the FireWise landscaping methods, your property and community have a better chance of surviving a wildfire. And here are some links, but we will put them up later. But that Ember video is very powerful. There's also some really great publications that delve into these topics much more. Keeping your home and property safe from wildfire. It can be downloaded from the Extension catalog. The FireWise website is another great one. And also, as you're doing all this great work, make sure you understand the local fire restrictions. Make sure you understand when burning allowed and is not allowed, and when you can operate chainsaws or weed whackers. And it's always to check daily in this time of year is a good idea. And so here's the links for those as well. And so that's all I had.
Thank you very much, Norma. Sorry, I'm looking at the chat comment that just came in.
While you do that, Sabra, I've got a question for Norma, if I can jump in.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, I have two questions. So one is about wood chips. So you mentioned a less than 2 inch deep wood chip layer. So when I was thinking about all of the work that you were talking about in those zones and the work we did at South Slough, the big question is, where's all that material going? And so I was really thinking about the wood chipping that we did out there and what your recommendation is is it a good idea to chip that wood if you're keeping it under the 2-inch, or is it really advisable to try and get that stuff off and take it elsewhere?
Right. So yeah, that's a great question. And in our coastal woodlands, we get so much biomass that builds up, and dealing with that material is so very challenging. So in the outer zones, I wouldn't put wood chips up near your house or a structure, but in the outer zones, leaving small amount of wood chips should be fine. They should decompose fairly quickly in our environment. But one of the reasons not to pile them up too high is they will deplete the nutrients in the soil and create kind of other weird issues as well. And there's also a far risk of them as also. And so Kelpie, who's talking next, is going to be talking about some great methods on how to deal with all this excess material.
Fantastic. And my other question, before other people jump in, is do you have, you said this seems like a lot of work for people, and you had great suggestions about breaking it down into zones to make it manageable. Are there services around Coos Bay and along the coast and how do we kind of find these services to help us with this defensible space work?
Right. Another really good question. So yes, there are folks who work with, there's basically near home stuff could just be lawn care services, really, yard care services. And as you get out further, you're talking about some of the bigger forestry services. And I can send a link to Sabra on a publication on how to hire a forestry contractor and making sure that the contractor is licensed and bonded and has the kind of background that you're looking for. But yes, there are, in our area in particular, tons of professionals in that nature who do the work.
Thanks, Norma.
Tracy just pointed out that land stewardship services will come and give recommendations for free. That's also another resource. Other questions for Norma? Great. Well, we're throwing a lot of information at you folks, so I'm glad that you're taking the time to digest it. Just a quick note for the self-sleep program that we're talking about for the early winter, basically after fire season officially ends, is we're actually going to be looking at a lot of the things that Norma mentioned, such as the zones of defensible space, the types of plants that go closer to buildings versus farther away. We're going to be using the Visitor Center as a on-foot case example of techniques that we've been able to implement, some that are we're still waiting for, but we can point them out, as well as hopefully having one of the fire services come out and be able to walk around and say, this is how long your driveway is, this is how accessible it is, how big or how accessible and how long our on-site water supply would last in the event of a fire. A lot of other practical knowledge that, again, is just good to have a on-site example of. So if anyone is interested in stuff like that, keep your eyes out for that announcement. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and switch over to Kelpie to talk about biochar. Oh.
Hi, everybody. I'm just sharing. All right, can you see the presentation?
Yes, looks good.
All right, Well, thanks for inviting me. And the first two speakers really set things up very well for what I want to talk about. The question is, what do we do with all this biomass now that we've figured out what we need to take out and how to manage the space around our homes? What do we do with it all? So this is a little bit about me. I've been doing biochar for quite a while. As a consultant and now as a trainer and also an equipment manufacturer. I've worked for the International Biochar Initiative. Before that, I was a journalist. That's how I found out about biochar. And before that, I've lived in Cave Junction since 1990. And I ran a group called the Siskiyou Regional Education Project. So I was very involved in forest protection and biodiversity and all of that. But my education is in engineering. So biochar really kind of combines my interests of conservation, biological diversity, climate change, and then renewable energy and thermal sciences. So I've been having a lot of fun with biochar. What I want to talk to you about today is what's the problem? How can making biochar in the woods help? Some of the technology and techniques to give you a little bit of a practical background in it, what the kind of bigger impacts might be on carbon and climate, and then talk about opportunities for jobs and training to do this work. So what's the problem? We've been suppressing wildfire, losing now a lot of forests to mega fires and severe fire. So we've really kind of gotten the natural carbon cycle and the natural fire cycle out of whack here. And this is having big negative impacts on forest health. So one of the things to keep in mind here is that these forests are fire adapted. I'm a little further from the coast than you are, but as Norma pointed out, there's been a history of fire on the coast as well. And biochar is actually a natural component of forest soils. So, not only do we need to think about the past, we need to think about the future and where we're going with climate change. And there's some really sobering information here about projections to where our forests are going. So, we need to think ahead a little bit and plan a little bit for how we can make our forests more resilient to a warming climate. Because bottom line is, we need to keep forests here. Forests are hugely important as a carbon sink, and of course we enjoy them so much. So I don't know why this thing is advancing. It's not supposed to do that. So here's the thing, is that our fire adapted forests need biochar. So recent research has looked at the soil horizon in the past and shown that the more recent part of the soil horizon is missing a biochar component that is supposed to be there, and this has unknown impacts on soil health and forest health. And we can also see that wildfire is one of the major contributors to charcoal. There's also, of course, a lot of evidence of historic burning. Traditional ecological practices of indigenous people did a lot of deliberate burning, but up to 50% of the carbon found in our soils can be biochar or charcoal. I'm just going to turn this pad off. Maybe it won't advance. All right, so this is important, and so wildfire has a real role. But on the other hand, now we're facing these mega fires. So we were talking earlier about the Labor Day fires in 2020. This was the Slater fire that burned back up behind my house and just really devastated a lot of our wilderness, the Siskiyou wilderness and other areas, massive, huge areas of severe fire. Okay, so how are we addressing this fire problem? We're doing vegetation management. And so I'm talking more on a larger landscape, not just defensible space, but so fuels reduction projects for pre-fire, and then post-fire, we still have a huge problem because fires leave behind a lot of dead trees. And this also material has to be dealt with. So these are activities that we have to do to keep ourselves safe and to keep our forests healthy. And so we've got to do this anyway. And so the question is, how could we actually leverage these mandatory activities to improve forest, soil, and forest health and resilience? The picture here is from one of many workshops I've done now in Paradise, dealing with these post-fire situations. So the goal ultimately is to return the natural fire regime if we can. And of course, to do that, we've got to do a lot of thinning. But that frequent low intensity fire regime is what put all the char in the soil. So whether it was from wildfire or from indigenous burning, that's how we got these high carbon, high biochar carbon soils in our forests. So what the kind of the prescription here would be is to do the thinning to reduce the fuels and then follow that by prescribed fire wherever possible. Another option, because prescribed fire is not always available, or can't always do it, is to make biochar in the woods, and that's another way of getting that biochar carbon in the soil. So the goals then of making biochar in the woods, and that's as opposed to hauling biomass out of the woods and making biochar in an industrial facility, which is of course a whole nother option. But for making it in the woods, first of all, is to avoid burn pile impacts, which can be considerable. Second, to improve forest soils and forest health. Third, to provide some jobs, because this is a massive undertaking with all the economic and social benefits of employment. And then fourth, to sequester carbon and hopefully ultimately to get paid for it so that they can help pay the cost of doing this work. So just to convince you that actually it is a good idea to make biochar and leave it in the woods, I want to share this picture of a bag of biochar I got from an industrial facility in Medford that makes it. And I had it just sitting in my backyard near this little grove of pine trees. And I it'd been there about 6 months, and I went to take some of the biochar out of the bag one day, and I saw all these roots growing up into the bag. And when I took a closer look, I could see that the fine root hairs were growing right in the particles of char. So I'm not really sure what these trees are getting out of the plain char here, but obviously trees do like biochar, and it is beneficial to them. So I'm now going to talk about the techniques and how we make biochar in the woods from material that would normally be just piled and burned. So I'm going to talk about the technique, the background of how flame carbonization, which is the term for the technique, how that works, and then the methods. And there's two main methods, what we call a conservation burn, which is just a different way of managing a burn pile. And then the second method is to use a flame cap kiln to improve the efficiency of the operation. So before I get into that, though, I want to say a word about how not to make biochar. So a lot of people, when they think about charcoal, they think about fuel charcoal, how it was made in a traditional setting using a kiln or a pit in the ground. And so this is optimized to make fuel, and in most of the methods that make it, it's very dirty and polluting. So a lot of people have a negative idea about making charcoal, and rightfully so, because these traditional methods are more of a smoldering process. There isn't really a flame. It's slow smoldering process, and it makes a char that's a different kind of quality. Sorry, I didn't turn off my phone. It's a different kind of quality than fuel charcoal. Fuel charcoal is going to be have more condensed volatiles in it, and as opposed to the char we make in flame cap kilns or in open burn piles, in flame carbonization, it is going to be a lot more pure carbon with less volatile matter in it, And it's going to be in characteristics a lot more like activated carbon than a fuel charcoal. So it's pretty much a different material. So here it is. This slide really explains how we make biochar in an open flame. And the key here is that biochar burns in stages. Biomass burns in stages, and the first stage is drying. And where water vapor leaves, you can see in the burn pile picture on the left there that's a lot of that is steam. When you first light a pile of slash that's got some moisture in it, it's smoke, but a lot of it is water. And then as the water leaves and the material dries out, then you start getting a higher component of volatiles. And the volatiles contain hydrogen and carbon and oxygen, but it's the hydrogen and things like carbon monoxide that actually really burn and feed the flame. So when you see a flame, that's gas burning. And when you see smoke, that's the gas that's condensed into particles. So a flame is just burning smoke is one way to look at it. So then after the volatiles are gone, then you have char, but it's still hot. So if you think about a campfire where you get to that glowing stage of glowing coals, that's the biochar, that's the charcoal. The volatiles are gone, the flame is gone. And now if you want to save the charcoal, that's your point where you can put out the fire before it burns to ash. And so that's where you would think again about your fire triangle, how you put out the fire. You have to remove heat, you have to remove fuel, or you have to remove oxygen. And I'll talk about ways that we do that. The diagram on the right then shows you how in a open fire, the char is formed because the outside of the piece of wood or the log is going to burn away, making that flame in order to get the heat to the inside. And so once the inside is fully charred, then you can put it out. But you do end up burning away some of the outside before the heat gets in there. So that's one of the reasons why when we're making biochar in the woods, we want to use smaller material. And fortunately, that's the material we most need to get rid of because that's, again, the highest fire danger. But the bigger logs, first of all, we don't really need to burn up a 6 or 10-inch log that's sitting in the woods on the coast. It's not going to be the highest fire danger. What we need to get rid of are the branches, the twigs, and the finer fuels, and those are exactly the materials that are easiest to turn into biochar. So here are the methods now. The first method, we call this a conservation burn. We could also call it a strategic burn pile. So it's a managed burn pile. And this is, the picture on the left just shows a standard sort of pile that the fuels teams leave behind. And we light it on top, we let it burn down, and then we put it out at the end with water. So here I am looking at a pile of char left behind from one of these burn piles, going back the next year to see what's growing in there. And you can see all these things are, mushrooms, herbs, orchids growing out of that burn pile. And this shows a difference between lighting in one of these burn piles on the bottom versus lighting it on top. Generally, the way that, if you've got a 20-acre project where they've been doing fuels reduction, they might go through and make 100 piles an acre, and then they come back after they've seasoned and with a drip torch and just sort of light them near the bottom to get the pile on fire. And it makes a lot of smoke because you don't have a flame on top. So this is a key part of this technique, is to light it on top if you can, or get the flame to come on top as soon as you can to burn the smoke. That also makes it hotter, and the flame is your heat source. So just to go back to the standard practice again, it's called a jackpot burn pile. It's constructed in such a way so that it will burn down into its own footprint and burn completely And so things don't fall out of it, and it gets rid of the fuels effectively. So that's a good thing. But often it leaves behind this scar, because when the char burns at the end, it burns really hot and it burns the duff layer. And so you've kind of destroyed, this you've punched a little hole in the forest soil, and it can take a long time for that soil to rebuild. In the meantime, it can get colonized by weedy species. So there's some downsides to the standard practice. So here we are in a project where we've done the standard burn pile, and we don't have water available from a water tender, but we have some backpack pumps. And so at the end, we kind of tried to rake it out a bit to cool it, and then spray it with a backpack pump. And here's what it looks like on the ground from the standard practice on the bottom versus spraying it. And you can see that on the top that there's still fir needles left there. So we didn't burn through the duff layer, and we managed to put the pile out with just 5 gallons of water. The one on the bottom, you can see, yes, some char got made, but most of it was ash, and we burned the soil down to the mineral layer. Here's just another picture showing what it looks like at a burn pile if you put it out with water at the end. Lots of biochar and little ferns coming up right through it the next spring. And so when we make biochar in the woods with these techniques, we're also applying it, because we're raking it to cool it, and we're putting out with water, and then there it is. It's a really kind of a form of biomimicry, because a cool, moderate fire would leave behind a similar kind of situation, and that's how biochar gets in the forest soils. Now here's some pictures from a workshop that we did up in Paradise in January or February this year. And you can see different techniques there. You can see a kiln in the upper left, and you can see 2 different styles of piles. One is a rick style, which is like a kind of log cabin stack. And the other one is more of a teepee style, where you've got the bigger logs around the outside. And interesting, different results from different piles like this. We don't end up always burning all the big pieces. But again, that's fine. We can partially char them. That's all good stuff for the soil eventually. And the bigger pieces are not a fire danger now. Here we're just showing the difference between doing the pile burn and putting out with water versus the standard practice. So on the right, where the people are standing around that circle, you can see that fire's still burning. And so this was Cal Fire burns these piles, and what they do is they'll come into an area, light off a bunch of piles, watch them for a little bit, for an hour or so, till they kind of burn down and they're not really flaming anymore. Then they go away and do something else. They come back that evening to check and see if it's, if there have been any embers blow out, any fire started. And then they'll come back the next day and check it again to make sure it's really out. Well, good for them. But if they were able to just put it out with water, and of course they can't do that everywhere, but if they can, it'd be more efficient. One and done, put it out with water. You've got the char. You haven't created this fire scar, and you don't have to worry about it anymore. So there's a little bit of a change in thinking that we need to have around these burn piles, where the goal has been to complete incineration. We want to get rid of the problem. We want to burn it all to ash, so we don't have to think about any of it being left. Whereas, if we put it out with water and save the char, we could maybe save some time, and we have the char and avoid the burn pile scar. So that's my lecture about burn piles. Now I want to talk a little bit about the flame cap kiln, because this technique can improve the efficiency of the biochar production, and it's even safer in a lot of ways. And the way this works, it's really just a burn pile in a bin. I first became aware of this from these pictures from Japan, where I guess people had probably been doing this for quite a long time. And there was one company that sold this kiln, And I saw it and I thought, gosh, I want to try that. So I've started making kilns. And basically the way it works is that as long as you have that strong flame on top, that's your heat source. And it also prevents the char that you've made from burning because it's using all the air. Because there's no air coming from the bottom, it all comes from the top. And that's basically how it works. This is the kiln that I designed that I'm now manufacturing and selling, called the Ring of Fire kiln. It's got a heat shield, which does some really neat things that improve the efficiency. Here's a diagram showing how it works. So the heat shield not only protects the operator from radiant heat, but it also preheats the air that goes into the kiln, so that improves the combustion efficiency, so it's very clean. And what you see then is you don't get any embers coming out of this. In fact, you can see that when you have a smoking stick that's up outside the kiln, the airflows will actually pull the smoke back into the kiln. So it tends to be very clean that way. Here are the steps for operating a flame cap kiln, whether it's the Ring of Fire kiln or just a bin that you might use. A lot of people have repurposed all kinds of things, from troughs to tanks. You can do it actually in a pit in the ground if you want to. But in all these methods, you use the same steps where you will load it up initially, kind of loosely packed slash. You light it on top. You let it burn down the first charge until it kind of gets to that glowing coal stage, and then you add more. So you keep adding more and more. And so you might be just dragging brush to it and adding more brush for a couple of hours. And then at the end, you put it out with water and you rake out your char. And, if you're a homeowner, in this case, this was someone who had a home in the woods. She's going to use it around her landscaping, and it will hold water and keep the landscaping a little more moist. If anybody's interested, give me a call. We can talk about getting you a kiln. So the cool thing also about making biochar in these containers is it's really easy to measure how much you made. So for instance, it just happens that 1 foot of biochar in a 6-foot diameter kiln is equal to a cubic yard of biochar by volume. And then if you make some assumptions that a cubic yard of biochar weighs 250 pounds, 8 cubic yards of biochar would be 2,000 pounds or a ton. We have a kind of rule of thumb a lot of people in the biochar industry use that a ton of biochar is equivalent to 2.5 tons of sequestered carbon dioxide. So that's important data to know if you want to try to pursue funding for some of this work with carbon sequestration credits. We'll see how that goes, but it's good to know. It's good to know that it's easily measurable. Looking at costs and outputs, comparing biochar in the woods methods to conventional pile burns. I just made up this matrix to, if you're land manager and you're looking at bigger projects, you need to really think about costs. And so your costs would be equipment, mobilization, moving things around, and labor. So with a conventional pile burn, there's no really equipment, and you're just moving a crew of people around. And it doesn't take that many people to light off piles. Although, if you have to come back and check them a lot, but your labor costs go up. With a conservation burn, you do need a little more equipment because you need to put it out with water at the end. And so that makes your mobilization cost a little higher. You need to bring a water tender. And you need a little more labor just to, put out the piles with water and just kind of pay a little bit more attention to what's going on. With the flame cap kiln, you also will need water and you will need kilns, but the kilns are not really expensive, so it's a minimal cost. And they're not hard to move around. So it's about the same as doing a conservation burn. For mobilization, your labor costs are going to be higher because you need to move a lot of material around and put it in a kiln. So you have to tend the kilns. So the labor is higher. Now looking at the outputs, soil impacts, emissions, biochar production, and carbon sequestration in the conventional pile burn, you're harming the soil, you have high emissions, you're not making much char, and you're not doing anything about carbon sequestration. In a conservation burn, this is very beneficial to soils. Not, much less emissions. You're making char, but not as much as you would with a kiln. So with the kiln, you have maximum benefits to soil, lowest emissions, highest biochar production, and the highest carbon sequestration. So just wanted to go through that little matrix with you to evaluate, which technique you might want to use. And I've been promoting this idea of looking at the Civilian Conservation Corps of the past and all the amazing work that was done under that program. And what Roosevelt said, he wanted to create the CCC to be used in complex work. And I emphasize that because it's, this thing we're trying to do, prevent fires, of restore forests, it's not easy or simple. And it's not something you can mechanize. You can't do it with a lot of, machines help, but you can't do it all by machinery. It takes the human touch. So in a way, that's a good thing because, we need jobs. We, especially, young people need kind of hope for the future and meaningful work, not just flipping burgers or whatever. So, most of our states now have some kind of conservation corps, California Conservation Corps, Northwest Youth Corps. And so this idea of a carbon conservation corps, just as a concept, I think is grabbing a lot of people and has a lot of potential to do good stuff. So who can benefit from these jobs that we're talking about creating? Well, these workforce development programs like California Conservation Corps, forestry contractors can be doing this work. Wildland firefighters can be doing this in the off season. Arborists, forest landowners are going to be interested in this, both private and public, along with the natural resources agencies, environmental NGOs, and then our residents of the WUI. So this is the kind of work that homeowners can do themselves. Also, there's potential in urban areas for this. So we have started a network called Biochar in the Woods. We did a full day seminar last January under the umbrella of the US Biochar Initiative. And so hopefully those links are in the chat. Anyway, all the recordings from that full day webinar are now available on the USBI YouTube channel. And then I do a lot of trainings, and I'm developing a network of other consultants and practitioners who can do field demos. So you can always contact me about that. And then we have this Biochar in the Woods discussion forum that's an online discussion forum, but we also do a monthly Zoom call. So you can join that and hear about all of that. And that's pretty much what I have for you. I've got a few project examples, but I don't know if we have time for more. Sarah, should I run through some project examples, or are we ready just to take questions?
I think we can pause to see if we have questions.
Okay.
Oh, Alice, yes.
I may as well just be the dominant question asker here, but hopefully I'll stimulate some other thoughts. Fantastic presentation, and we purchased a flame cap kiln at South Slough, I want to say a year and a half or so ago, and we've been having fun getting to know it and learning more about it. So this was really helpful for us. I had a couple of questions. I guess, first of all, with your when you were talking about the piles out in the forest, and you're sort of igniting them from the top down. So do you build those piles differently? So the conventional sort of burn pile, you put a lot of fine fuels on the bottom and then large wood on the top. Would this be the other way around? You put your fine fuels on the top to try and promote that top burning?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. There's a lot of considerations though, because, first of all, are you going to cover the pile to keep it dry? What size materials you have, etc. So traditionally, or conventionally, the way the piles are constructed in Oregon anyway, is there's usually a pocket of fine fuels inside, maybe not on the bottom, but kind of in the middle. And that's usually a good idea, because if you're not covering them, they can get wet on the top. So you want some fine fuels that aren't soaked. Sometimes what we've done is we've kind of reached in there and grabbed the pocket out and put it on the top. So yeah, there's just a lot of considerations that way. And mainly I started always saying, always light it on the top, always light it on the top. But I guess I would say, if you can just get that flame on the top quickly. So if you can put some dry stuff on top so that the flame migrates up there quickly, then that can help a lot. But I think there's also a lot of work to do in developing these techniques. So I'm encouraging everyone to experiment with different methods of pile construction.
Great, thank you. Unless someone else has a question, I'll just keep sitting around for a little bit of time. So with biochar creation with your kiln, is that with dried material? Can you do it with freshly cut materials?
Another great question. Now, I want to go back to what Brenda said about fuel moisture, and how less than 20% is like, okay, that's going to propagate a fire. More than 35%, this is going to suppress a fire. Those are exactly the numbers I use when I'm evaluating, fuels for making biochar. So less than 20% is going to be great. It's going to work really nicely in a burn pile or in a kiln. More than 35%, I'm like, don't bother. You're not going to, you're going to spend so much of you have trouble getting it lit, and you'll spend so much of your heat energy on drying the fuel, it won't be very efficient. Now, there's some caveats there. So small hot material with a lot of volatiles, like ceanothus is one thing that I've used here. If it's just twigs, little brush up to 1 inch, I've successfully charred that, cutting it and charring it green. So if it has a lot of volatiles, that means it has fuel. The volatiles are fuel. And, so that you can do quite well burning that in a kiln. It's really going to depend. Scotch broom and gorse should probably work well too. I don't have any direct experience with those materials, but I actually would really like to see if Scotch broom can burn green in a kiln. So,
well, we can test that for you, because we've
okay.
been doing some Scotch broom removals.
Yeah,
So
I'm pretty sure gorse will. I don't know. Gorse has a lot more volatiles than Scotch broom. Is that correct?
I think so, yeah. But
yeah, there's some
again,
folks up on the Olympic Peninsula that are just desperate to get rid of Scotch broom. So.
And then just finally, do you have any information on permits required? I know, you want to avoid the fire season and all that kind of stuff in terms of restrictions on when you can do it. But is there anything that one would need to know about the timing of using a flame cap kiln and the process, if there is any, of going through that?
Another excellent question. So in Oregon, I have always proceeded just in accordance with the open burning permitting. So I just get a regular burn permit when I'm using a kiln. And I've had, the local fire department out here, and they're like, we love this because it is so much safer. And I did want to say, that one of the reasons for homeowners to use these techniques is I see a lot of burn piles just sitting around. People got the message that they need to treat fuels and, create defensible space, but then they have these piles and they don't have a lot of they don't know what they're doing, and so I either see burn piles just sitting around and everybody's like, oh, I know I need to burn that, but I'm kind of scared. I'm not really sure how to do it. I don't want to make smoke and, annoy the neighbors. Or I see really badly done burn piles. They don't know how to construct them. They don't know how to burn them safely. And, what the fire district says to me is, what people do is they make this pile and it's not well constructed. It sits there and it just smolders, and they get tired of watching it, so they go in the house to do something, and that's when the wind kicks up and takes an ember off and starts a grass fire, and we get called and to come out. So they love it that it's in a container. They love it that it goes fast. When you're doing a flame cap, you have more heat, so it doesn't smolder. It goes fast. It doesn't take all day, and you've got a hose there because you want to save the char. So you have water right there. So it's just a real win-win in terms of safety and in terms of a good technique for homeowners. Did I answer your question?
Absolutely. And that, I won't dominate it anymore, but that last comment just reminded me, how much water do you need on hand when you're working with your flame cap kiln?
Another great question. So again, the fire triangle, you need to get rid of the air or the heat or the fuel. So we do a combination of usually raking thin to lose heat and spraying with water. So if you're not raking it, you're going to need a lot more water. The thinner you can rake it, the less water you need. But I can quench 2 cubic yards of char with 100 gallons of water, which is a lot, but that's not that much. And especially if you're near the home, you've got a hose probably that can reach that far. You can also get a little 100, 200 gallon tank that goes in the back of a pickup if your property's a little bigger, or an ATV, something like that. So, it's generally not that difficult to get the water you need.
Thank you. I'll let other people jump in from your questions.
Well, let me just say also that, when we were doing it with the backpack pumps out in the woods, one thing I didn't mention is that when we raked out those coals, we started a few stumps on fire. So that's something to really be careful of. If you have minimal water and you're relying on raking things out, you need to watch it. I mean, we put them out easily, just with dirt, but you need to pay attention if you have minimal water, that those coals aren't starting other things on fire like stumps.
Another plug for our winter program on site will be, if the conditions are right, we're hoping to do one day with our kiln, doing a practical biochar demonstration on site, and then doing the visitor center and other talks the next day, again, if conditions are right. And thank you very much, Kelpie, for answering that. And I want to open it up to questions for all of our speakers, if anyone had any that they didn't ask before. Although, of course, if you think of something later, in the resources packet I'll be sending out in the next day or two, there will be all the contact information in there. And Not seeing any more questions. I'm going to go ahead and ask folks to look at the evaluation, the link that I just put in the chat. Again, this is really important for our reporting and also continuously improving our programs. It takes less than 10 minutes. You also get a link to it in the follow-up email. And one other thing for that in-person program that we're hoping to do after this year's fire season ends is if you are like a lot of us and have very strict or restricted travel budgets, even for those of you farther up north, we can definitely offer housing and potentially other types of travel assistance. So if that is something that you think you might be needing, if you're interested in coming down here, please feel free to reach out to me. Yes, and the hybrid sessions are something that we're trying to move forward with and a model that we're trying to use more often. So if there aren't any more questions, I'd like to thank our speakers.
Sabra, I'd like to speak a little bit about the next program, if you have a minute before you close up. Although I'm sorry for interrupting you with thanking the speakers, that's a very important part. I just wanted to say, I mentioned earlier about the vision for this fire program really was to have a really diverse look at fire. And so some of the other things or topics that we would like to touch on and have experts come in are prescribed burns or cultural burns. And we've got some folks from the tribes who would like to speak to us about the way fire was and is being used to manage cultural resources, but also during active fire management. So when there's a wildland fire on the landscape, how do you protect those cultural resources as well from getting damaged? So those are some of the other topics, I guess, that we're hoping to touch on. And I'd like to say probably the reason there's not many questions in this is because people were so thorough. Every time I thought of a question, you just went ahead and answered it without me even mentioning it. I mean, and Brenda and Norma have been incredible resources for South Slough in all of the work that we do here on fire, and my interns that are here at the moment really benefited, and Kelpie as well with our biochar. But sorry, Sabra, you can go ahead and thank them. I just wanted the opportunity as well.
No, those were all great additions. But yes, thank you very much to all of our speakers for putting together this information and dedicating your time and expertise to this. Again, this is the first in what we're hoping will be a long partnership addressing something that is, touches all of us, whether in our professional or personal lives.